I wanted to talk a little bit about memory. And actually, on the Blackboard tab that I have, I moved away from the videos. Not that I showed other video, but one of the videos has a picture of a couple of characters from Finding Nemo. One of them being, sorry? Dory.
Dory.
Who has this memory issue. And so it's a little video talking about how memory and amnesia is represented in movies. When I came across that video on YouTube, it was kind of interesting. It sort of covers some things that I like to talk about. And so I want to describe some aspects of memory, and I want to relate it to some movies. Now, when I say that the temporal lobe is associated with memory, there are a number of different memory functions, especially visual memory, that take place in the temporal lobe. But the sort of most important part of the brain for being able to form long-term memories is found in the temporal lobes, specifically the medial temporal lobes, which would basically be the inner surface of the two temporal lobes that we can see, sort of where I'm pointing at right here. Within that area is a structure called the hippocampus, which is necessary for forming long-term memories, as well as some of the surrounding gray matter that's covering it. The reason why we know so much about this aspect of the brain comes from a patient who had surgery performed because of a severe epileptic condition. So the guy we watched on the video earlier, Joe, there had epilepsy, and he had a corpus callosum transection to fix it. This other patient, who's rather famous for this particular procedure, had a bilateral temporal lobectomy, which means that both medial temporal lobes were cut out and removed because that seemed to be the site where his epilepsy started. It was bilateral, so it was pretty severe. So they went in and physically cut out that part of the brain. He's the only person that's ever had that particular procedure performed because it had such a devastating effect on his memory. The patient's referred to as patient HM. He has passed away in the past 5 years sometime. So he's often referred to by his full name, which I don't remember what it is anymore. But I'll just refer to him as patient HM. He had the surgery performed when he was, I guess in about his 20s, which would have been in the mid-50s or so 1953, 1958, somewhere in there. After having the surgery, he lost the ability to form any new memories. He can remember everything leading up to the surgery. He can remember all of his early life, but he can't remember anything that happened to him since the surgery. So he has a type of amnesia that's rather severe. Nobody's ever had this procedure performed again because of this devastating effect. But because of this, sort of like Joe there in the video that we watched, patient HM was the subject of a lot of studies on memory function. We learned a lot of important things about how memory works. And so I want to illustrate sort of some of the things we know about memory by talking about a few movies that deal with amnesia, kind of the amnesia that patient HM had. The first movie I want to talk about is sort of like a really bad example, because sometimes Hollywood can get science really bad. And I want to use it to sort of set up some of what I'm talking about. So the movie I want to talk about is called Blank Slate. If you've never seen it, I don't suggest you see it. It's not very good. It stars Dana Carvey, who you may or may not know. He's famous from Saturday Night Live quite a while back. He's probably best known for being Garth in the Wayne's World sequence in movies. He also performed the church lady character quite a bit, which was really popular, I guess, back in the 90s. Probably after this movie, he didn't do a whole lot of serious acting. I don't think it did a whole lot of good for his career. But it's not entirely his fault. The movie has some serious problems. It was set up as kind of this noir murder mystery. When I say noir, that's sort of getting to the early LA kind of crime drama idea. And the murder that he had to figure out was a murder that he was accused of committing. But of course, he has amnesia, so he can't remember whether or not he did it. So to clear his name, he has to prove that somebody else did it. And the movie makes use of this Hollywood trope that's kind of annoying when you really pay attention to it, that somebody can remember things throughout the whole day, but then when they go to sleep, they lose their memory. When they wake up the next morning, they don't remember what happened to them before. That's not how memory works. And one of the things that we learned from patient HM is that being able to remember something, keeping something working memory, you can keep it there for about 10 minutes. If you rehearse the information, practice it, you can keep it there longer. I mean, if somebody gives you a phone number and you commit that to memory, you can probably remember that phone number for about 10 minutes. But if somebody gives you a phone number and you keep repeating it over and over and over again, you'll remember it as long as you rehearse it. And after rehearsing it a whole bunch, the memory might last even longer. But of course, nowadays that doesn't really matter. Nobody memorizes phone numbers anymore. It's always in your phone. But that's sort of the idea. That people can really remember things for about 10 minutes. And these Hollywood movies that show people remembering things all day long and then they lose their memory when they go to sleep at night, that's just not the way the memory works. Now, the story had its problems because of that sort of approach to memory, which not everybody's going to get upset about, like I might. But another thing that really bothered me about it was the way they tried to explain his memory loss. And usually movies make the biggest scientific mistakes when they try too hard with the science. And so I think the writers for this movie were just looking up conditions that present with this kind of memory problem. And so they happened across one that was totally inappropriate. They said that he had what was called Korsakoff syndrome. And the thing about Korsakoff syndrome is, yes, it would in fact result in this kind of amnesia. Of course, not the remembering something all day until you fall asleep, but not being able to form new memories kind of amnesia. The problem is that Korsakoff syndrome comes from somebody who's a severe alcoholic. When somebody drinks so much that they'd rather drink more alcohol than take in any nutrients, to eat food or anything like that. The lack of nutrition that comes from that starts to cause problems in the brain. It actually affects a different part of the brain than the medial temporal lobe, but it has the same basic effects. And another problem with Korsakoff syndrome is that it's a degenerative disease, which means that if somebody has Korsakoff syndrome and they have memory problems, it's just going to get worse until it's fatal. And in the movie, it just didn't work because the guy didn't drink, wasn't somebody who was an alcoholic or anything like that. And of course, at the end of the movie, he got his memory back for the happy ending. But that's not at all how that sort of thing works. Now, the movie had plenty of other problems, and I strongly recommend you avoid seeing it if given the chance. But that's sort of the worst example. The next example actually seems to be similar to that picture, but they do it a little bit better. And that's 50 First Dates, which you might have seen with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. It has that same kind of trope that she wakes up in the morning and she thinks that it's the day after she lost her memory. And she goes all day long, and then when she falls asleep, she sort of resets. And that's wrong. We've already established that. But what I like about the movie is that they deal with that because there's this character in the movie called 10 Second Tom. You've ever seen the movie? It's kind of a funny little gag. So Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore and a couple of other characters go to this mental institution, and they're introduced to 10 Second Tom. And he says, "Hi, very nice to meet you," shakes one person's hand. Then it says, "Hi, very nice to meet you," shakes the next person's hand. "Hi, very nice to meet you," shakes the next person's hand. "Hi, very nice to meet you," shakes the next person's hand. And then goes back to the first person and says, "Hi, I don't think we've met. What's your name?" Because he has a 10-second memory span. Now, that is not at all true. Like I said, we can remember things for about 10 minutes. But that was sort of the nod in the movie to this is how memory really works. To have 10-minute Tom would have been a horrible joke because you'd have to remember 10 minutes earlier in the movie something that happened and you forgot. So the 10-second thing is to set up a better joke. But it sort of shows the writers know something about the memory stuff, but they had to have Drew Barrymore's memory be that old Hollywood trope thing for the sake of the story. The other thing they did well in that movie is they didn't try to explain what happened to her so much. There's just this vague explanation that she was in a motor vehicle accident. And that actually would fit with the problem she had. If you're in a motor vehicle accident and your head hits the steering wheel or the dashboard, the brain is going to move within the skull a little bit, and the medial temporal lobe is right against the sphenoid bone. And it's entirely possible that somebody could have an injury right there in the same fashion as this patient HM that I mentioned. So it's believable that that could be the basis of it. And they don't say too much about what actually happened, trying to over-explain or anything like that. But that's a reasonable cause for her condition. And then at the end of the movie, she doesn't get her memory back. Okay? They found a way for her to cope. Every morning she wakes up and she sees a video explaining everything that's happened to her. And that's sort of like her surrogate memory. So when she wakes up in the morning, she can remember everything that happened thanks to the video. So that's a little bit better movie. The third movie is even better dealing with the science stuff. And it's a movie called Memento, which you may or may not have seen. If you haven't seen it, I strongly suggest you go see it, unless you don't like weird stuff. The movie comes from Christopher Nolan, who's most famous for the Batman trilogy, and his brother Jonathan Nolan, who's most famous for writing the script for Interstellar that came out last year. And Jonathan Nolan is very serious about having good science in his scripts. Christopher Nolan, not so much. A lot of the things in the third Batman movie really shouldn't have been there, but Jonathan Nolan didn't write it. But in Memento, it's also kind of this old-fashioned LA crime story, mystery, murder kind of thing, like Blank Slate, but it's done really, really well. Now, it's not set back in the 30s or something like that. It's set in modern day LA, but it has that kind of feel to it. The main character has this memory problem. He can't make new memories. And he's also the main, the point of view for the movie. So you don't get to know what happened right before whatever scene you're watching in the movie. The movie's actually told in reverse order. So the very first thing you see is the last part of the story. And then you back up 10 minutes to see what happened just before that. Because the guy can't remember what happened just before that when he's experiencing that scene. So you don't get to know it either. And then you back up and you see what happened right before leading up to it. And then you go back and you go back and you go back and you go back. It's really an inventive way of telling the story. And it reflects that idea that we can't remember things for more than about 10 minutes. One of my favorite transitions in the movie is it goes to this scene, and he's standing there, and he's in between two motorhomes or something like that in a parking lot. He's like, now what am I doing here? And then you hear a gunfire in the background. He goes, oh yeah, he starts running off. And he's being chased by somebody who's shooting at him. And then when it goes back 10 minutes in the story, you find out how he got to the point where he's being chased down by somebody shooting at him in the parking lot. So it's kind of a somewhat realistic way of portraying that experience. The way that he lost his memory is explained vaguely, just like in 50 First Dates. The most likely thing that happened is that somebody broke into his house, and the murder that he's solving is who killed his wife, which would be one of these people that broke into his house. And all that he remembers are these kind of vague flashbacks of falling and hitting his head on the side of the bathroom sink, which would be the same thing like the car accident. It could definitely cause that kind of trauma there. The really interesting thing about the movie, and I don't want to spoil things too much if you get a chance to watch it, there's actually an alternate explanation for his loss of memory in there. And the fact that he's the main character and he can't remember why he lost his memory, and we're really just going on these vague impressions he has from these flashbacks. That tends to be thought of as the reason why he's lost his memory. But if you really watch the movie closely, there's a second and alternative explanation why he might have lost his memory. So if you haven't seen the movie, then I strongly suggest seeing it. It's a really well done movie. Unless you're not into the really weird stuff like telling a story backwards and trying to figure out what's going on from that, you probably won't enjoy the movie that much. But if you saw Interstellar or the Batman movies and you liked either or both of those, then Memento's by those same people, the Nolan brothers, and that's probably everyone. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of the temporal lobe and the medial temporal lobe, which we can't really see because this is a lateral view of the brain, would be right around this area, but on the medial side of the temporal lobe. And that's where the hippocampus is found. And it's sort of the main part of forming those long-term memories, which the patient HM that I mentioned earlier, and really the characters in the movies I just talked about, they all have problems based on losing that kind of memory formation. Although blank slate, they got the science very wrong. It's what's behind the causing that. Another video that's in the video content area, which actually I want to go back to real quick. I'm not going to show you this video either, but if you're interested in watching it, this one right here, the reason I'm going to it is so I can point at this word and I don't have to write it down somewhere. Prosopagnosia, that's a fancy Greek word that basically means face blindness. And the person that's in the video here, his name is Oliver Sacks. And down below, I mentioned a little bit about Oliver Sacks. He's a rather famous neuroscientist who's well known because he's written several books to popularize understanding of what's going on in the brain. And one of his books that was quite popular was called Awakenings. It was made into a movie with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, which is, as far as scientific representation of things in movies, is amazing. Really, really well done movie for that. But Oliver Sacks himself has a problem memorizing faces or remembering faces. So he's talking a little bit about that himself. One of his other famous books, which I mentioned down here, is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And there's a few stories about different clinical cases that he was involved in that book. But there's a couple that have to do with recognizing faces and that kind of thing. The reason I'm mentioning that is I want to go back to this area here. this picture here and talk a little bit more about the specialized functions that we see in the cerebral cortex, in the outer covering here. This picture is showing us the 4 major lobes. In the book, after this section here, the next part is showing data from a study a long time ago, back in 1909, by this guy Brodmann, who looked at microscopic images of the different regions of the brain, and the color that's on here is added to the picture, but the black and white sort of patterns that he's drawn on here shows the different areas of the brain. He found, I think, 52 areas altogether of anatomically different tissue within the brain, which we found corresponds quite well to functionally different parts of the brain. I had the area right here kind of highlighted in this pink, which runs along the medial surface of the occipital lobe, and then it comes just a little bit to the lateral surface here. That's area 17, which is the part of the brain that first processes visual information. And then next to that, in kind of the darker shading, the next area there deals with more visual information. And then in the book, I go into talking about how visual information is processed going up into the parietal lobe and down into the temporal lobe. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail because it's in the book. I'll explain it quite a bit there. The area that I have the cursor on right here, this stippled area, and I think this part right next to it, which is kind of the lateral surface of the temporal lobe. Those areas are very important for face recognition. And that video I was just pointing out about prosopagnosia, I think that Dr. Sachs is talking about problems that he has with this particular part of his brain right here, which has to do with recognizing faces. And so in the book, when I'm talking about processing in the dorsal and the ventral streams for visual recognition, I'm getting at sort of the parts of the brain that are responsible for that. Normally what I do is I go on to talk a little bit about the language function that's represented in some of these colored areas here. I'm going to save that for next week. That'll fit in with some of the clinical stuff we talk about next week. So I'll pick up with that next week. What I want to do with the rest of what we have today is to look at part of the peripheral nervous system section, which is looking at ganglia and nerves. So it starts off just with the anatomy aspect of it, which this is a micrograph that's very similar to the slide I showed you before a couple of weeks ago, where we saw the unipolar neurons. Those would be found in this ganglion here. And here's just a higher power image of some of those kinds of pictures. And then it talks about the structure of nerves. I showed you a couple of images of nerves. Remember the ones that were stained with the black stain that highlights the lipids? That kind of goes with this stuff here. And then it gets into talking about cranial nerves, which I want to spend a little bit of time on, followed by spinal nerves, which I'm not going to talk about here. But I wanted to point out spinal nerves versus cranial nerves, because what these two groups of nerves represent, basically, are the connections from the central nervous system out to the periphery. Cranial nerves are nerves that are connected directly to the brain, most of them through the brainstem, but a couple through the forebrain structures of the cerebrum and diencephalon. And then the spinal nerves are connected to the spinal cord. Some of what I'm going to talk about next week will touch on the spinal nerve stuff. But I want to talk about the cranial nerves here. Now, in this week's folder, there's a lab quiz. It's called the Cranial Nerve Lab Quiz. And so I sort of want to go over this material to prepare you for that quiz a little bit. What I've done in the past, before I had this book to work from, is I handed out a table, which we basically went through everything in the table in class, and it's this table here. I just reproduced it in the book. The first column gives you a mnemonic, 12 words that will help you remember the names of the 12 cranial nerves. They're numbered in order using Roman numerals here, and then here are the names. And then their basic functions. In this column, it has S, M, or B in parentheses after each one. S means sensory, that it's a nerve that's just responsible for sensory function, like the olfactory nerve is the nerve that carries the sense of smell into the brain, or optic for vision. M is for motor, and those are nerves that are strictly responsible for making some sort of movement. So the ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens nerves are all eye movement nerves. They help control the muscles that attach to the outside of the eyeball to move it around inside the orbit. And then B, stands for both, which is when there's a nerve that has both motor and sensory function to it. So this one that I'm pointing at, the facial nerve, for instance, is responsible for motor control of the face, meaning facial expressions. And then it's also responsible for the sense of taste. Now, it's not the only one responsible for the sense of taste. We see taste down here, number 9 also. But that's its sensory function that's associated with it. The next 2 columns list what in the central nervous system the nerve is connected to, whether it's the target of the nerve, like a sensory nerve targets a nucleus in the central nervous system, like the olfactory bulb or the hypothalamus, thalamus, and midbrain, or for taste, it goes to the solitary nucleus, those sorts of things. Or the nucleus that's responsible for sending signals out to control motor muscle movement. So the ocular motor nerve originates out of the ocular motor nucleus, which tells particular muscles around the eye to move. So this is the central component, central connection, either the target or the source of the nerve. And then the peripheral connection is the ganglion or muscle in the periphery that's either the source or the target of the nerve. So sensory nerves like the olfactory come out of some structure out in the periphery, like the olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity, or the 8th cranial nerve is coming from ganglia associated with the inner ear, which are listed there. And then muscles that are being controlled, like the facial nerve that has the motor control of the face, is obviously going to go to the facial muscles, which are listed there. So that's how this is set up. There's a problem that I want to point out, and I have a very easy fix for it. Right here, for cranial nerve number 5, under the peripheral connections, it just has the word trigeminal, which is the name of the nerve too. The rest of what's supposed to be in this cell got cut off. What I've done on Blackboard in the current week folder, in the nervous system anatomy folder, there's a link that says Cranial Nerve Study Guide, and you can download that. I've already downloaded it onto this computer, so I'm just going to open it back up. It's a Word document. And I've downloaded like 4 times here. So here's the table again, and here's the word trigeminal. That's the only thing in that cell for the trigeminal nerve. It's supposed to have the rest of what's written in here underneath it. The trigeminal ganglion has 3 branches. The tri and trigeminal is referring to that. So these are the 3 branches that are part of that. So that just, for some reason, got cut off in the book itself. I have this document in Blackboard because I've I've had it in there longer than I've been using the book that has this table in it too. So I just left it because of that little part that got cut off in the table. In this version, under function, it doesn't have the S, M, and B letters next to each one. I never put that in this version, but you saw it there. Whichever version we're talking about here, I want to point out a couple of things. This mnemonic here, on old Olympus towering tops, the Finn and German viewed some hops, is an old-fashioned kind of mnemonic. If you go to Wikipedia and you search for cranial nerve mnemonic, there's a page on Wikipedia that has a couple of dozen different mnemonics listed. So if it helps you to remember things, to look at this sort of thing, go through and see if any of those help you remember a little bit better. I like to use this one for a couple of reasons. One, it's the one I've always used, so I'm very familiar with it. And two, the first three letters are all O's, standing for the olfactory, optic, and oculomotor nerves. And in this version, it's on old Olympus. The other versions, well, not all of the other versions, but of the couple dozen versions on that page I just mentioned on Wikipedia, some of them are some variation of this, usually not a very good variation, but some variation based on this idea. And then the other ones fall into sort of a group that all start with the word O, O-H. So it's O-O-O. And I don't like that because it's three different nerve names, so they should each have a different word going with them in the mnemonic. This seems like that's the way it should be. Another reason why I'm using this one instead of that OOO version is because that's also a dirty mnemonic. Mnemonics are very useful for medical students that are trying to get a lot of information in a very short time. For example, in medical school, in the first year, during the spring semester, traditionally, students take gross anatomy, which is the anatomy of the entire system, and neuroanatomy, which is specifically the brain. They usually have 2 or 3 months, well, maybe just 2 months for gross anatomy to learn all of the anatomy of the entire body except for the brain. And then they have another 2 months to get the anatomy of just the brain. And so that's a lot of information very fast, and medical students like to use mnemonics as a quick way to catalog information. And generally they found that making them a little bit on the dirty side helps them remember the mnemonic. So this is not dirty. Probably when this was a common mnemonic, which might have been back in the 30s or 40s or something like that. Talking about beer, meaning hops, might have been kind of risque or something like that. But, risque?
Risque.
Yes. But nowadays, there's got to be sex in it. Now, I've never committed the dirty version to memory, so I don't accidentally use it in class to offend anybody. But it starts with O-O-O, like I said. There's at least one letter, one word that starts with a V, and then the last one starts with an H, which in the dirty version of the mnemonic, the H word is hymen. So you can kind of figure where they're going with that sort of thing. And if you're really curious, it's on the Wikipedia page. But this is what I've given you. Now, there are a couple of problems with using this one because it is pretty old. The first one is cranial nerve number 8. In the mnemonic, the word that we use to remember the nerve, is and. The A in and corresponds to the word auditory. And back in the 40s or whatever, when this mnemonic was common, that nerve is called the auditory nerve because it's the nerve that comes from the ear, and so we associate it with hearing. But nowadays, it's actually called the vestibular cochlear nerve because the inner ear is responsible for 2 things. It's responsible for balance and hearing. So vestibulo is referring to the vestibular sense, the sense of balance. And cochlea is referring to the structure of the inner ear where hearing takes place. It's shaped like a snail's shell kind of thing, which is where the word cochlea comes from. So this V word here is a little bit more up-to-date name, more politically correct, if you will, because it addresses both of the senses that are actually carried by that nerve. The other thing is the 11th cranial nerve, the word that I'm using here starts with S, which as I've laid this out, it makes sense because that stands for spinal accessory. The thing is that most sources will just call that the accessory nerve. It's left off spinal. I've kept it here for two reasons. One, it matches with my mnemonic better, and also I think it's important to understand that real word, that real name for it. When you call it the accessory nerve, you don't know it's an accessory to, but calling it the spinal accessory nerve makes it very obvious. It's an accessory nerve to the spinal nerves. So if we look at this vertebral column model here, all of these yellow things coming off the side, these are the spinal nerves. The cranial nerves are coming off at the level of the skull, which isn't in this picture. But cranial nerve number 11 controls muscles of the head and neck. So head position kind of stuff. The first couple or few spinal nerves also control those muscles because those muscles extend out of the head and neck region into the shoulders. So it has to be controlled by spinal nerves and cranial nerves. And so the spinal accessory nerve is responsible for controlling those those muscles that are also controlled by some of the first spinal nerves. They work together. It's an accessory to that nerve. Okay. So I think it's useful to include spinal in that name, just to remember that it's working with the spinal nerves there. If you look at the letters that I included for functions here, S, S, M, M, B, M, B, S, B, B, M, M. There's another mnemonic that can go with that, which there is, again, a dirty version of, but let me provide you with my cleaned up version of that, which is, some say marry money, but my brother says brains, beauty matter more. Okay, so that's 12 words. S, S, M, M, B, M, B, S, B, B, M, M. The words that start with S are talking about cranial nerves that are just sensory. The ones that start with M are cranial nerves that are just motor. And the ones that start with B are cranial nerves that are both sensory and motor. 1, 2, and 8 are all sensory. 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 are strictly motor. And then 5, 7, 9, and 10 are both. So it just lays it out there. Now, like I said, I've cleaned this up a little bit. What I did is these two words here, brains and beauty, I changed those from the original dirty version. The two words here, obviously both have to start with B. The one in place of brains is big. The other one, you can figure out what would go there. If you can't imagine what that is, I'm very embarrassed to say that it's out on the wall there. So across from either the elevators or a little bit down the hall from there, there's a little case that has some information about the cranial nerves. And the student that made that put up the alternate version of here, which is certainly not politically correct. I don't know which of my colleagues allowed that to happen, but that's what's up there. So if you look up there, you'll see what the again dirty version of this is really about, if you haven't figured that out. Between this mnemonic and the other one, which was on old Olympus towering hops a Fin and German viewed so with these two, you can actually kind of get a lot of information about the cranial nerves. Mnemonics aren't about memorizing information so much. I mean, that's how they're usually used. But you can make more of them if you combine them. So these are in order. The first cranial nerve is sensory, and it starts with an O. The second cranial, which is the olfactory. The second cranial nerve is also sensory and also starts with an O, which is the optic. The third is motor and starts with an O for oculomotor. Motor, trochlear, et cetera, et cetera. If you have this information together and there's something very simple about how the nerves are laid out, you can get a lot of information very quickly out of it. The cranial nerves are laid out from anterior to posterior pretty much in order. Okay? The olfactory nerve, number one, is connected at this part of the brain. It's the most anterior. And then 2 is next, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Now, actually, 11 and 12 are backwards as I'm talking about it. And that's just because the spinal accessory nerve extends down into the spinal cord area. So it actually is more posterior than 12. But that's just a little quirk. Otherwise, you can remember that where they're located. And also, what they control kind of follows that pattern too. Not necessarily anterior to posterior, but the olfactory nerve starts with smell, which is located in the nasal cavity. And then the optic nerve is for vision. And then the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve and the abducens nerve are all about controlling the eye muscles. And then the trigeminal nerve controls or receives sensory information from the surface of the face, as well as controlling the muscles that close your jaw. And then 7 is controlling muscles of your face and the anterior part of your tongue for taste. 8 is hearing and balance coming from ear to ear. 9 is the posterior part of your tongue, as well as control for taste, as well as controlling some of the motor functions in the oral cavity and upper pharynx. So we're in the mouth region. And then 10 is weird. It actually controls organs in the thoracic and upper abdominal cavities. But then 11 is controlling muscles of the neck, and 12 is controlling muscles in the throat. So you go from 1 to 12 across the face. Also, you go from 1 to 12 across the ventral side of the brain. And you can think about what functions each one goes with, whether it's sensory, motor, or both, in terms of where it's connected. And you can really kind of put all the information together and to some degree recreate what's going on with the cranial nerves from what I've covered in the book. Like I said, I used to go over this stuff in a lot of detail in the class before using this book. Now, in the book, I present a lot of the material that I used to cover in class. So you kind of have all the stuff you really need to get out of this right there in the book. So with that, you're prepared for the cranial nerves lab quiz, which is in this week's folder. And looking at the surface of the brain stuff earlier, the lobes and some of the functions I talked about, that goes with the rest of the neuroanatomy lab quiz, which is in last week's folder. But that kind of gets that stuff taken care of. Now, like I said, I did this with my night class last week, and so I'm trying to kind of keep everything together. Since doing it with them last week, as I did it today, I kind of took a different approach to covering some of this stuff. I cut out some of the extra talking that I don't think was necessary. And so I got through this material by the end of the class. I'm going to stop here with you today because, again, I want to keep things consistent. And next week we'll pick up with this kind of information. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the functions associated with the cerebral cortex, and then we'll also look at some stuff deeper inside the cerebrum, and touch on the spinal nerves to some degree. And a lot of that I'll do within the context of some other kind of clinical approaches to talking about things. So we'll pick up with that stuff next week. So put the brain models back where you got them from. If it says 502 on the brain model, and it goes back on the card here. If it says 500, it goes in the back corner there. And otherwise, that's it for today. Have a nice week.